The morning mist rose from the Yellowstone River Valley on May 15, 1912, as 17-year-old Mary Keenan walked the final quarter mile to her new position at the grandest house in Montana. Her boots, polished the night before until they gleamed like black mirrors, crunched on the imported white gravel that had been shipped from Italy at a cost that exceeded her father's annual mining wages. Above her, through the dissipating fog, rose the copper-red towers and limestone facades of a 34-room mansion that locals had already begun calling the house that Copper built. But Mary, like the 43 other servants who would report for duty that morning, knew it by another name, one whispered in the boarding houses of Butte and the workers' quarters of Milltown. They called it the Ghost Palace, not for any supernatural presence, but because William Andrews Clark, the man who built it, spent less than 30 nights a year within its walls. This $3.2 million testament to Gilded Age excess, worth $96 million in today's dollars, would stand for barely 4 decades before vanishing from the Montana landscape, taking with it the stories of those who built it, maintained it, and ultimately watched it fall. Chapter 1. The Empty Throne Room. The grand ballroom of the W.A. Clark Mansion stretched 92 feet from end to end, its coffered ceiling soaring 28 feet above floors of Tennessee pink marble that had never known the scuff of dancing shoes. On the September afternoon in 1925, when William Andrews Clark drew his last breath in his Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, 300 miles from this Montana monument to his ambitions, the ballroom's 14 crystal chandeliers hung in darkness, their 8,000 individual pieces catching only the filtered sunlight that penetrated the drawn velvet curtains. Clark had commissioned the mansion in 1908, at the age of 69, ostensibly as a summer retreat from the heat of his primary residences in New York and Los Angeles. But those who knew the Copper King understood the deeper motivation. This wasn't merely a house. It was Clark's answer to the grand estates of Marcus Daly, his bitter rival in Montana's notorious War of the Copper Kings, and to the Eastern establishment that had rejected his bid for social acceptance despite his $150 million fortune. The mansion rose on a 2,000-acre estate along the Yellowstone River, halfway between Butte, where Clark's copper mines generated $1 million monthly, and Helena, where his political machinations had once purchased him a U.S. Senate seat, a scandal that led to his forced resignation and cemented his reputation as one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. Every detail of the house was designed to surpass anything west of Chicago. 34 rooms arranged across 56,000 square feet, with a foundation that required 800 railroad cars of granite from Clark's own quarry in the Tobacco Root Mountains. Yet for all its grandeur, the mansion embodied a fundamental contradiction that would define its brief existence. Clark built it to establish his Montana legacy, but he had already emotionally abandoned the state that made him wealthy. By 1912, when the mansion was finally completed after 4 years of construction, Clark spent most of his time in his $7 million Fifth Avenue mansion, or his Los Angeles estate. The Montana Palace became what one contemporary observer called a monument to absence, fully staffed, impeccably maintained, perpetually waiting for an owner who rarely came. The construction statistics alone revealed the scope of Clark's ambition and excess. The mansion featured 24 bedrooms, 15 bathrooms with gold-plated fixtures, a swimming pool lined with Venetian tiles, and a 200-volume library whose books were selected not by Clark, but by a New York decorator who purchased them by the yard based on the color of their bindings. The kitchen complex, larger than most middle-class homes of the era, contained equipment capable of preparing meals for 500 guests, though records indicate no gathering ever exceeded 100 people. Most telling was the mansion's art gallery, a 2,000-square-foot wing specifically designed to house Clark's collection of European paintings, except Clark never moved the collection from New York. The gallery stood empty save for inferior copies, its specialized lighting and climate control system maintaining perfect conditions for masterpieces that existed thousands of miles away. This empty gallery became a metaphor for the entire enterprise, a perfect shell waiting for a life that would never inhabit it. The human cost of maintaining this empty palace was staggering. A permanent staff of 44 individuals worked year-round, their combined annual salaries totaling $78,000, more than most Montana businesses generated in profit. The head butler, James Morrison, oversaw a household that operated with military precision, maintaining schedules for rooms that went unvisited for months, polishing silver that was never used, and preparing guest suites for visitors who never arrived. As news of Clark's death reached Montana that September evening in 1925, Morrison gathered the staff in the servants' hall. According to the diary of Mary Keenan, by then the head housemaid, Morrison's announcement was brief. "Mr. Clark has passed. We are to maintain the house as if he might return at any moment until instructed otherwise." For 6 more months, the staff continued their routines, cleaning empty rooms, tending gardens that no one strolled, maintaining an estate whose purpose had died with its creator. The mansion had become what it had always truly been, a magnificent stage set for a play that would never be performed. Chapter 2. The Copper King's Crown. William Andrews Clark arrived in Montana Territory in 1863 with nothing but ambition and a talent for recognizing opportunity where others saw only wilderness. Born in a Pennsylvania log cabin in 1839 to Scotch-Irish immigrants, Clark possessed what one contemporary described as an almost frightening ability to transform the earth's hidden wealth into personal fortune. By the time he commissioned his Yellowstone mansion 45 years later, he had amassed the kind of wealth that defied comprehension, equivalent to $5.8 billion in today's currency. Clark's path to fortune began not in copper, but in humble trading posts, where he exchanged supplies for gold dust from prospectors in Bannock and Virginia City. Unlike the miners who sought quick riches, Clark played the long game. He invested his profits in hauling mining equipment from Salt Lake City, each journey netting him 500% returns. By 1872, he had accumulated enough capital to purchase his first copper claims in Butte, just as the world's hunger for electrical wiring was about to transform copper from a minor metal into industrial gold. The choice of location for his mansion was no accident. The site, overlooking the Yellowstone River between Columbus and Park City, sat at the geographical center of Clark's Montana empire. From the mansion's third-floor observatory, equipped with a $50,000 German telescope, Clark could theoretically survey lands that contained his timber operations in the Bitterroot Valley, his smelters in Great Falls, and most importantly, his copper kingdom in Butte. The location was both strategic and symbolic, a command center for an industrial empire that stretched across the state. Yet Clark's relationship with Montana had always been transactional rather than emotional. Unlike his rival Marcus Daly, who immersed himself in Montana society and built the town of Anaconda as a model community, Clark viewed the state as a resource to be extracted. His business practices reflected this philosophy. While Daly paid his miners $3.50 per day, above the regional average, Clark kept wages at $3 and opposed every effort at unionization. When miners at his properties struck in 1903, Clark imported strikebreakers from Minnesota and had union leaders arrested on fabricated charges. The mansion's design reflected Clark's complicated relationship with authenticity and appearance. He hired New York architect Walter Beaux-Arts, instructing him to create something that would make the Vanderbilts take notice. Beaux-Arts' design borrowed liberally from the Château de Chenonceau in France's Loire Valley, but Clark insisted on modifications that prioritized ostentation over architectural integrity. The result was what one architectural critic called a greatest hits compilation of European luxury, performed by an orchestra that had never visited Europe. Clark's personal life during the mansion's construction revealed the contradictions that defined him. His first wife, Kate Stauffer, had died in 1893, leaving him with 6 adult children who viewed their father's increasing extravagance with embarrassment. In 1901, at age 62, Clark secretly married his 23-year-old ward, Anna Lachapelle, in France. The scandal, when it became public, only reinforced Eastern society's perception of Clark as a crude Western upstart attempting to purchase respectability. The financial mechanics of the mansion's construction exposed the source of Clark's wealth in stark terms. Every dollar spent came from the Butte copper mines, where 15,000 men worked in conditions that killed an average of 1 miner every week. While Clark selected 30,000 tullets worth of Italian marble for his mansion's bathrooms, families in Butte's Dublin Gulch neighborhood, home to his Irish workforce, lived in shacks without running water. The mansion's $200,000 heating system, revolutionary for its time, contrasted sharply with the mining families who burned scrap wood to survive Montana winters. Perhaps most revealing was Clark's approach to art and culture within the mansion. He allocated $500,000 for art purchases, hiring agents in Europe to acquire important works by known names. But Clark himself had no genuine interest in art beyond its value as social currency. When asked about a Corot landscape he had purchased for $75,000, Clark reportedly said, "I don't know much about it, but I'm told it's the most expensive Corot in private hands." As construction progressed through 1910 and 1911, Clark spent most of his time in New York, where he was building an even grander mansion on Fifth Avenue. The Montana house became increasingly abstract to him, a line item in monthly reports from his estate manager, a subject for correspondence with architects and decorators, but never a home. When he finally visited the completed mansion in June 1912, he stayed exactly 3 days before departing for his daughter's wedding in Newport. He would return only 7 more times in the remaining 13 years of his life, each visit shorter than the last. Chapter 3. Building the Impossible Palace. On a frozen morning in February 1909, 400 men stood in the snow along the Yellowstone River, waiting for the steam whistle that would signal the beginning of the most ambitious private construction project in Montana history. They had come from across the American West and beyond: Italian stonemasons from Colorado, Swedish carpenters from Minnesota, Irish laborers from Butte, and a contingent of 47 Chinese workers who had been brought specifically for the detailed wood carving that would decorate the mansion's interior. The project's chief engineer, Harold Patterson, had overseen the construction of railroad terminals and federal buildings, but even he was unprepared for Clark's demands. "Mr. Clark wants the impossible," Patterson wrote to his wife, "and he wants it completed yesterday, and he's willing to pay any price except the one that matters. Time to do it properly. The foundation work alone required innovation." The site Clark had chosen sat on a floodplain that had been underwater as recently as 1904. Patterson's solution was to sink 186 concrete piers, each 30 feet deep, filled with a revolutionary mixture of Portland cement and crushed granite. The foundation consumed 14,000 barrels of cement, creating what Patterson called a fortress against nature that could support a building 5 times this size. Material acquisition became a logistical symphony of unprecedented scale. The Tennessee pink marble for the main floors required the construction of a temporary railroad spur from the main Northern Pacific Line to the building site, a $400,000 expense for a single delivery. The roof's Welsh slate tiles, 44,000 of them, traveled by ship to Seattle, by rail to Montana, and finally by wagon to the site. Each tile was individually numbered in Wales to ensure proper installation, a detail that added $50,000 to the cost, but reduced installation time by 3 weeks. The human dynamics of the construction site revealed the harsh realities of American labor in 1909. The Italian stonemasons, led by master craftsman Giuseppe Moretti, earned $6 per day, double the rate of common laborers, but half what similar craftsmen earned in New York. The Chinese woodcarvers, despite creating the mansion's most intricate features, received only $2 per day and were required to live in segregated quarters a mile from the main camp. When several Chinese workers protested these conditions, Clark's managers had them arrested for inciting disorder and deported. Working conditions varied dramatically based on ethnicity and skill level. The skilled European craftsmen lived in wooden dormitories with heating stoves and basic amenities. The common laborers, predominantly Irish and Eastern European immigrants, slept in canvas tents even through the brutal Montana winter of 1909 to 1910, when temperatures reached 30 degrees. The Chinese workers were forbidden from entering the main camp after dark, a rule enforced by armed Pinkerton guards hired ostensibly to protect the construction materials. The technical challenges seemed to multiply daily. The mansion's indoor swimming pool, one of the first in Montana, required the installation of a complex heating and filtration system designed by engineers from Chicago. The system's boiler alone weighed 14 tons and had to be assembled in place because no entrance was large enough to accommodate it intact. When the pool was first filled in March 1911, the heating system failed catastrophically, flooding the basement with 50,000 gallons of water and delaying construction by 2 months. Perhaps no feature better exemplified the mansion's excess than the electric lighting system. Clark insisted on complete electrification at a time when most of Montana still relied on gas or kerosene. The mansion required its own power plant, built at a cost of $300,000, with 2 massive generators capable of producing enough electricity for a town of 1,000 people. The 14 chandeliers in the main rooms each required individual wiring systems that could support their massive weight. The ballroom's central chandelier alone weighed 2,000 pounds. Labor tensions erupted repeatedly throughout construction. In July 1910, the Irish workers struck when they discovered the Italian stonemasons were earning double their wages. Clark's response was swift and brutal. He fired all 73 striking workers, blacklisted them from future employment at any of his properties, and brought in replacement workers from Chicago. When local union organizers attempted to support the fired workers, Clark used his influence to have them arrested on vagrancy charges. The most tragic incident occurred in November 1910, when a scaffold collapse killed 3 workers and injured 7 others. The victims, 2 Irish laborers and 1 Chinese woodcarver, were buried in unmarked graves at the county cemetery. Clark paid their families a total of $500 in compensation, less than the cost of a single bathroom fixture in the mansion. The accident was never officially investigated, and construction resumed the next day. Despite these setbacks and tragedies, the mansion rose with remarkable speed. By December 1911, the exterior was complete, and attention turned to the interior finishing. The mahogany paneling in the library required 6 months to install, with each panel hand-fitted by German craftsman Wilhelm Steinbach, who had decorated railcars for European royalty. The hand-painted ceiling in the music room, depicting scenes from Wagner's operas, took Italian artist Paolo Vincenti 4 months to complete while lying on scaffolding, developing a permanent curvature of his spine that would plague him the rest of his life. As the mansion neared completion in early 1912, the total cost had reached $3.2 million, nearly double the original estimate. Clark seemed unbothered by the overrun, viewing it as proof of the mansion's significance. What he never calculated was the human cost. 4 men dead, dozens injured, hundreds exploited, and entire families disrupted by the demands of his ambition. Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage. The first grand gathering at the Clark Mansion occurred on July 4, 1912, a carefully orchestrated celebration designed to announce Clark's palace to Montana society. 300 guests arrived in a special Northern Pacific train chartered from Billings, their journey ending at a temporary platform built specifically for the event at a cost of $15,000. As they ascended the marble steps to the main entrance, a 30-piece orchestra from Denver played Strauss waltzes from the second-floor balcony, their music drifting across grounds where 2,000 Japanese lanterns would illuminate the evening ahead. Mary Keenan, recently promoted to second housemaid, later recalled the weeks of preparation. "We polished every surface 3 times. The silver alone took 8 of us 4 days. Mrs. Morrison had us practice serving patterns until our feet bled. Mr. Clark himself arrived only the morning of the party, inspected everything for 20 minutes, and declared it adequate." The evening's menu, preserved in the mansion's records, revealed the absurd lengths to which Clark went to impress. Oysters from Chesapeake Bay, lobster from Maine, beef from his own Montana ranches, and strawberries from California, all kept fresh in the mansion's revolutionary refrigeration system that cost more than most Montana homes. The wine cellar, stocked with $200,000 worth of French vintages, opened its doors for the first time, though Clark himself abstained, preferring to drink milk from his prize Jersey cows. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the party exposed the hollowness at the mansion's core. Clark, now 73, moved through his guests like a specter, engaging in perfunctory conversations before retreating to his study. His wife Anna, 38 years his junior, served as the actual host, her vivacious personality unable to mask the obvious discomfort between her and Clark's adult children, who were older than their stepmother. The daily operations of the mansion during its golden period, from 1912 to 1920, resembled a luxury hotel more than a home. The staff of 44 maintained rigid schedules, fires lit in all 24 bedrooms at 5 a.m., regardless of occupancy, fresh flowers arranged daily in 37 vases throughout the house, the pool heated to exactly 78 degrees by 10 a.m. each morning, though months might pass without anyone swimming. The hierarchy among servants was as rigid as any aristocratic household. James Morrison, the English butler, commanded an annual salary of $3,000 and ruled the domestic staff with iron discipline. Below him, the housekeeper, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, managed the female staff while maintaining bitter rivalry with Morrison over territory and authority. The kitchen staff, led by French chef Auguste Beaumont, operated as an independent kingdom, refusing to acknowledge Morrison's authority and reporting directly to Mrs. Clark when she was in residence. The mansion's most peculiar resident was Clark's youngest daughter, Huguette, born in 1906, when Clark was 67. During her rare visits, the teenager would spend entire days in the mansion's art studio, painting and practicing violin, avoiding both family and staff. The servants whispered about her strange behavior, her preference for eating alone, her habit of speaking French to avoid conversation with Montana guests. None could have predicted that Huguette would outlive them all, dying in 2011 at age 104, having spent her final decades as a recluse in New York hospitals, her father's fortune still largely intact. The expense of maintaining the mansion boggled contemporary observers. Monthly operating costs reached $15,000, including $3,000 for coal to heat the structure through Montana winters, $2,000 for staff salaries, $500 for food and supplies, and $1,000 for groundskeeping. The mansion consumed 40 tons of coal monthly during winter, its 14 furnaces running continuously to maintain the 70-degree temperature Clark demanded. Social events at the mansion were rare, but memorable for their awkwardness. Local society, such as it was in Montana, felt simultaneously honored. and insulted by invitations. Clark's obvious disdain for his guests — he once referred to a gathering of Billings businessmen as provincial merchants — created an atmosphere of mutual discomfort. The elaborate dinners, served on Limoges china with golden flatware, couldn't disguise the fact that host and guests had nothing to say to each other. The mansion's technological marvels often proved more trouble than they were worth. The interroom telephone system, connecting 30 stations throughout the house, constantly malfunctioned due to moisture from the indoor pool. The central vacuum system, revolutionary for its time, required a full-time engineer to maintain, and was so loud when operating that it could only be used when the family was absent. The electric dumbwaiters, designed to silently deliver meals from kitchen to dining rooms, frequently jammed, requiring food to be carried up the service stairs, exactly the labor they were meant to eliminate. By 1920, the pattern was established. Clark would visit for a few days each summer, Anna might stay for a few weeks, and the adult children avoided the place entirely. The mansion had achieved its purpose as a symbol of Clark's wealth and power, but it had failed utterly as a home. It stood as a perfectly preserved monument to a life that was lived elsewhere, maintained by a staff who spent more time in its rooms than the family who owned it, a golden cage that imprisoned both servants and masters in an elaborate performance of wealth without purpose. Chapter 5. The Price of Grandeur. Behind the mansion's limestone facades and beneath its marble floors existed a parallel universe invisible to guests, but intimately known to the 44 souls who spent their lives maintaining Clark's empty palace. This shadow world operated according to strict rules, elaborate hierarchies, and grinding routines that ground down the human spirits who inhabited it. Their stories, preserved in diaries, letters, and employment records, reveal the true cost of Gilded Age grandeur. Thomas Sullivan, a 19-year-old Irish immigrant from Butte, began work as a junior footman in 1913 for $25 monthly plus board. His letters to his sister in Boston provide an unvarnished view of servant life. "The house is a wonder to see but a hell to work in. We rise at 4:30 to light fires in rooms no one will enter. I polish silver that hasn't been used since I started. Morrison the butler is a tyrant who times our trips up the service stairs. Yesterday he docked James a day's pay for a thumbprint on a doorknob in a room that's been locked for months." The female servants faced additional burdens. They were required to remain unmarried. Any hint of romance meant immediate dismissal. Mary Keenan's diary records the fate of Ellen Murphy, a parlor-maid who received a marriage proposal. Ellen was given 2 hours to pack, 8 years of perfect service forgotten. Mrs. Thornton said marriage would divide her loyalty. Ellen wept as she left. She'd saved $400 over 8 years, enough perhaps to start a small shop with her intended. The rest of us learned the lesson. The ethnic divisions among staff reflected and intensified broader American prejudices. The Chinese laundry workers, Li Wang and his 4 assistants, were paid half what white servants earned for similar work. They were forbidden from eating in the servants' hall, required to take meals in the laundry room. When Li Wang's son died in the influenza pandemic of 1918, Morrison denied his request for 3 days' leave to attend the funeral. Li Wang never returned after his single approved day of absence. The kitchen operated under its own brutal regime. Auguste Beaumont, the French chef, ruled through intimidation and violence. He once threw a pot of boiling water at a kitchen maid who had improperly trimmed asparagus, scarring her arms permanently. When she complained to Morrison, she was dismissed for creating discord. Beaumont's rage was partly explained by his situation. Hired at great expense to prepare elaborate meals, he found himself cooking for empty dining rooms, his culinary masterpieces consumed only by staff or discarded. The physical demands of maintaining the mansion were crushing. The laundry processed 500 pieces weekly, whether worn or not, as all linens were changed on schedule regardless of use. The housemaids walked an estimated 15 miles daily, climbing the equivalent of 50 flights of stairs. Sarah Patterson, a housemaid from 1914 to 1919, developed severe arthritis in her knees from constantly kneeling to scrub floors. When she could no longer work, she was dismissed with 2 weeks' pay and no pension despite 5 years of service. The isolation of the estate compounded the servants' misery. The nearest town was 12 miles away, accessible only on monthly half-days off, if Morrison approved. Many servants went months without leaving the grounds. William Davies, a Welsh gardener, wrote to his brother, "I tend the most beautiful gardens in Montana, but I am a prisoner here. The roses I grow have more freedom than I do, at least they can spread beyond their beds." Perhaps most revealing were the health records maintained by Dr. Robert Harrison, who visited monthly to treat servant ailments. His notes, discovered during the mansion's demolition, catalog an epidemic of depression, anxiety, and psychosomatic illnesses. "The staff exhibits unusual levels of nervous exhaustion," he wrote in 1917. "The combination of isolation, repetitive labor, and the absurdity of their situation, maintaining an empty palace, appears to be taking a severe psychological toll." The few times Clark was in residence created panic among staff. His arrival triggered 48 hours of frenzied preparation, with servants working 18-hour shifts to ensure perfection. Clark's habit of running his finger along surfaces to check for dust terrorized housemaids. His practice of entering service areas unannounced to inspect efficiency led to constant anxiety. During one visit in 1919, he dismissed a footman for having scuffed shoes, despite the fact that the wear came from the servant's daily 20-mile walk through the mansion's corridors. The wage disparity between Clark's wealth and his servants' poverty was staggering. While Clark's daily income from his copper mines exceeded $30,000, his housemaids earned $20 monthly. The entire annual servant payroll of $36,000 represented what Clark earned in roughly 30 hours. Yet servants were charged for broken items. A dropped plate could cost a week's wages, and were required to pay for their own uniforms from approved suppliers who charged inflated prices. Some servants found ways to resist. An underground economy developed where staff redirected surplus food to needy families in nearby communities. Others engaged in deliberate slowdowns, taking advantage of the mansion's size to avoid supervisors. A few brave souls attempted to organize, distributing union pamphlets, but Clark's network of informants quickly identified troublemakers for dismissal. The human cost extended to servants' families. Children grew up without parents who worked 6.5 days weekly. Marriages collapsed under the strain of separation. Mary Keenan's diary contains a heartbreaking entry from 1920. "Received word that my father died 3 days ago. Morrison granted me 1 day for the funeral. I'll spend more time this week polishing silver that will never hold food than I spent saying goodbye to the man who raised me." When the mansion finally closed, most servants found themselves unemployable elsewhere, their specialized skills useless in a changed world, their bodies broken by years of labor, their spirits crushed by the absurdity of their sacrifice. Chapter 6. The House of Cards Collapses. William Andrews Clark died at 2:47 a.m. on March 2, 1925, in his Fifth Avenue mansion, surrounded by nurses, doctors, and exactly 0 family members. His wife Anna was in Paris, his daughter Huguette in her adjacent apartment refusing to enter her father's room, and his other children scattered across the continent, their relationships with their father having long ago curdled into mutual indifference. Back in Montana, the news reached the mansion at 6 a.m. when Morrison received a telegram containing just 4 words: "The senator has passed." What followed was not grief but confusion. Clark's will, when finally read, revealed an estate valued at $47 million but provided no clear direction for the Montana mansion. The property was part of a trust so complex that 17 lawyers would spend the next 3 years attempting to untangle its provisions. Meanwhile, the 44 servants continued their routines, maintaining an empty house for a dead man while their wages arrived increasingly late and eventually not at all. The first sign of trouble came in September 1925, when the September payroll failed to arrive. Morrison, maintaining his rigid dignity, paid the servants from his personal savings while sending increasingly desperate telegrams to Clark's executors in New York. The response, when it finally came in October, was devastating. The mansion was to be maintained at minimal expense pending disposition. The staff of 44 was to be reduced to 8 immediately. Mary Keenan's diary captures the scene. Morrison gathered us in the servants' hall. His hands shook as he read the names of those who could stay. The others had 2 days to vacate. Mrs. O'Brien, who'd been here since the beginning, fainted. Thomas Sullivan threw his polishing cloth at Morrison's feet and walked out without a word. We who remained looked at each other like survivors of a shipwreck, wondering why we'd been saved and whether salvation was actually a curse. The mansion's decline was swift and merciless. Without sufficient staff to maintain heating throughout the structure, pipes began bursting during the brutal winter of 1925-26. Water cascaded down the main staircase, destroying the hand-painted silk wallpaper that had cost $50,000. The indoor pool, left unheated, cracked along its marble edges. The wine cellar flooded when spring snowmelt overwhelmed the primitive drainage system, destroying thousands of bottles of vintage champagne and Bordeaux. The legal battle over the estate revealed the dysfunction that had always plagued the Clark family. William Jr., Clark's eldest son, wanted the mansion demolished and the land sold. Huguette, through her lawyers, insisted it be preserved exactly as her father left it. Anna Clark, the widow, showed no interest whatsoever, having already established herself permanently in Paris with a considerably younger companion. The other children fought primarily over the art collection, though none wanted the Montana property itself. By 1927, nature had begun reclaiming the estate. The elaborate gardens, once maintained by 12 groundskeepers, became overgrown wilderness. Deer wandered through the untended topiary. The greenhouse, its heating system long dead, became a crystal coffin for thousands of exotic orchids and tropical plants, their frozen forms creating what one visitor described as a garden of glass flowers, beautiful and thoroughly dead. The remaining skeleton crew fought a losing battle against entropy. Morrison, now 73, and suffering from arthritis, could barely climb the stairs he'd once ascended dozens of times daily. Mary Keenan found herself responsible for 34 rooms she couldn't possibly maintain. They closed off entire wings, draining pipes and covering furniture with sheets, creating a ghostly landscape within the mansion. The few visitors who came during this period reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms and seeing shadows in abandoned corridors, not ghosts, but the desperate movements of too few people trying to preserve too much space. The financial records from this period reveal the absurdity of the situation. The estate continued paying $1,000 monthly for insurance on art that had been removed, $500 for grounds keeping on gardens that had gone wild, and $300 for security provided by one elderly night watchman who spent most of his shift sleeping in the kitchen. Meanwhile, legitimate expenses like roof repairs and heating oil were deemed excessive by executors who had never set foot in Montana. Local scavengers began targeting the mansion in 1928. First, small items disappeared: doorknobs, light fixtures, pieces of marble from less visible areas. Then bolder thieves arrived. In November 1928, an organized crew removed an entire chandelier from the music room, apparently having studied the building's plans to know when the skeleton crew would be in other areas. The local sheriff, when called, reportedly said, "That place has been stealing from Montana for 20 years. About time Montana got something back." The psychological toll on the remaining staff was severe. Morrison began exhibiting signs of dementia, often preparing for visits from Clark as if the man were still alive. He would set the dining table for 12, light fires in the study, and stand at attention by the door for hours. Mary Keenan wrote, "We don't know whether to correct him or play along. Perhaps his madness is kinder than our sanity." The final blow came in January 1929, when the estate's lawyers announced that the mansion would be sold at auction to satisfy tax debts. The furnishings would be sold separately, the art had already been removed to New York, and the building itself would likely be demolished for its materials. The remaining staff were given 30 days' notice and minimal severance, $100 for Morrison after 18 years of service, $50 for Mary Keenan after 16 years. The auction, held on March 15, 1929, was a grotesque carnival. Locals who could never have entered the mansion as guests now wandered its halls as potential buyers, commenting loudly on its pretensions while secretly coveting its fixtures. The golden bathroom fixtures sold for scrap value. The library's mahogany paneling was purchased by a hotel in Billings. The hand-painted ceiling from the music room was cut into sections and sold as individual artworks. Chapter 7. Demolition and Ghosts. The Yellowstone Development Company purchased the Clark Mansion and its 2,000 acres for $43,000 on March 15, 1929, barely 1% of its construction cost 17 years earlier. The company's president, Harold Jamieson, announced grand plans to convert the estate into a luxury resort that would rival anything in the Rockies. 7 months later, the stock market crashed, taking with it Jamieson's financing, his company, and any hope of the mansion's preservation. Through the early years of the Great Depression, the mansion stood empty, a 56,000-square-foot symbol of excess in a time when families were living in tents along the Yellowstone River. Local newspapers ran bitter editorials about the Copper Palace that had cost more to build than the entire town budget for a decade. In 1931, a group of unemployed miners' families attempted to occupy the mansion, arguing that its empty rooms could house 100 desperate people. The sheriff evicted them after 3 days, but not before they had stripped remaining fixtures and burned much of the mahogany paneling for warmth. The systematic demolition began in 1935, when the Continental Salvage Company of Chicago acquired demolition rights for $8,000. They approached the mansion's destruction with the same industrial efficiency that had characterized its construction. First came the inventory: 14,000 square feet of marble flooring, 800 windows, 400 doors, 11 miles of copper wiring, and enough brass fixtures to fill 3 railroad cars. Frank Morrison, a demolition foreman unrelated to the mansion's former butler, kept detailed records that provide a grim accounting of the palace's dismantling. The marble floors that had cost $30 per square foot to install sold for 50 cents per square foot. The custom windows, each one individually crafted in Belgium, were valued at scrap glass rates. The mansion's revolutionary electrical system, once the pride of Montana, was ripped out and sold as copper scrap at 3 cents per pound. Mary Keenan returned to witness the demolition in September 1935. Her diary entry from that day is haunting. "I watched them tear apart the ballroom where I had polished every inch of floor until it reflected like water. The chandelier I had cleaned crystal by crystal lay shattered in a heap." Frank Morrison, our Morrison, was there too, his mind mostly gone, asking the workers when Mr. Clark would be arriving. They laughed at him. I let him away before they could mock him further. The human scavengers were followed by nature's. Once the roof was removed, Montana winters began their work. Snow filled the ballroom, ice split the remaining marble, and wind scattered papers from Clark's study across the prairie. Local ranchers reported finding canceled checks for thousands of dollars blowing across their fields like autumn leaves, worthless paper from a vanished empire. The demolition revealed hidden spaces and forgotten tragedies. Workers discovered a sealed room in the basement containing the personal effects of servants who had died during the 1918 influenza pandemic, apparently locked away rather than returned to families. They found a series of letters hidden in the walls of a maid's room, desperate love notes from someone signed only T that chronicled a doomed romance between servants. In the wine cellar's furthest corner, they discovered the skeleton of a dog wearing a jeweled collar worth more than a worker's annual salary. Some materials found second lives that would have appalled Clark. The mansion's grand staircase became the bar in a Billings saloon. The marble from the master bathroom was fashioned into tombstones. The library's remaining books, those not valuable enough for New York dealers, were sold by the pound to paper mills. The indoor pool's Venetians, tiles ended up decorating a brothel in Butte, a detail that would have particularly galled the prudish Clark. The demolition crew made an unexpected discovery in January 1936, a hidden vault behind the study containing $50,000 in gold certificates and bonds that Clark had apparently forgotten. The legal battle over this discovery lasted longer than the remaining demolition, with workers, the Salvage Company, and various Clark heirs all claiming ownership. The money eventually went to pay back taxes on the estate, with the lawyers taking most of what remained. As word spread about the demolition, former servants and their families began arriving to claim small mementos. The demolition foreman, showing unexpected kindness, allowed them to take doorknobs, tiles, pieces of wood, tangible connections to years of their lives spent in service. Sarah Patterson's daughter came for a piece of marble from the floor her mother had scrubbed until her knees gave out. Thomas Sullivan's widow took a brass door handle he had polished every day for 6 years. By spring 1937, only the foundation remained. Those 186 concrete piers that Harold Patterson had sunk 30 feet into the Montana earth. Even these were eventually dynamited and hauled away, the crater filled with dirt and planted with wheat. Within 5 years, no visible trace remained of the mansion that had once dominated the Yellowstone Valley skyline. Local folklore began almost immediately. Ranchers reported seeing lights where the mansion once stood. Hunters claimed to hear orchestra music drifting across the empty fields on summer evenings. The site became a destination for teenagers seeking thrills, and treasure hunters convinced that more gold remained hidden. Some claimed the ground itself was cursed. Crops planted there failed, animals avoided the area, and more than one person reported feeling suddenly, inexplicably sad when crossing what had been the mansion's threshold. The last official act related to the mansion came in 1941 when Mary Keenan, working as a seamstress in Billings, received a package from New York. Huguette Clark had sent her a check for $1,000 and a note. For your years of service to my father's dream, however foolish that dream might have been. Chapter 8. Unearthing Buried Truths. In 1987, Montana State University graduate student Jennifer Hartley was researching labor conditions in early 20th century Montana when she stumbled upon a cache of documents that would revolutionize understanding of the Clark Mansion. Hidden in the basement of the Yellowstone County Courthouse were 14 boxes of uncatalogued papers that had been seized for tax purposes but never examined. What Hartley found challenged every official narrative about the mansion's construction and operation. The first revelation came from payroll ledgers that previous historians had never seen. While Clark's official biographers claimed he employed several hundred well-paid workers, the actual records showed systematic wage theft. Workers were charged for tools, lodging, and even the water they drank on the job. The Chinese woodcarvers, supposedly earning $2 daily, actually received 60 cents after deductions. Many workers ended their employment owing money to Clark's company store, a debt that followed them for years. More shocking were the medical records Hartley discovered. Dr. Robert Harrison had maintained secret duplicate files documenting 31 deaths during the mansion's construction, not the 4 officially reported. These included 8 men killed in a tunnel collapse while building the private railroad spur, never reported to authorities, 5 deaths from typhoid in the workers' camp, blamed on personal hygiene, 7 Chinese workers who disappeared after a confrontation about wages, listed as voluntary departures, and 11 deaths from industrial accidents that were recorded as occurring off-site to avoid compensation claims. Hartley's research attracted the attention of the Yellowstone Historical Society, which funded a limited archaeological excavation of the mansion site in 1989. What they found transformed understanding of the property. The workers' camp, supposedly temporary structures, had actually been a complex of underground dugouts where Chinese and Eastern European workers lived in conditions archaeologist Dr. Michael Roberts described as incompatible with human dignity. These earthen shelters, invisible from the mansion, housed up to 200 men in spaces designed for 50. The excavation uncovered personal artifacts that told intimate stories. A photograph of a Chinese family that would never be reunited, rosary beads worn smooth by desperate prayers, a child's toy carved from scrap wood, probably made by a father who saw his children once a month if he was lucky. Most poignant was a jar containing 43 letters in Italian, never sent, from Giuseppe Moretti to his wife in Tuscany, chronicling his growing despair and eventual resignation to never seeing home again. In 1992, descendants of Chinese workers formed the Montana Chinese Heritage Foundation and pushed for fuller investigation. They funded translation of documents that revealed an organized system of exploitation. Chinese workers were required to sign contracts in English they couldn't read, agreeing to terms that included indefinite extension of service for unsatisfactory performance. A determination made solely by Clark's foreman. Several workers spent 5 years building the mansion while being paid for 2. The foundation's research revealed that Li Wang, the laundry supervisor mentioned in official records as a loyal servant, had actually been a university-educated engineer in China, reduced to washing clothes because American law prohibited Chinese from practicing professions. His personal papers, discovered in a great-nephew's attic, contained detailed architectural drawings suggesting improvements to the mansion's design. Improvements that were implemented but never credited to him. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of Anna Clark's personal correspondence, donated to the University of Montana by a dealer who had purchased them at a Paris estate sale. Her letters revealed full knowledge of the exploitation. "William insists on economy in the strangest places," she wrote to her sister. "He'll spend $30,000 on a chandelier, but refuses to provide adequate food for the workers. I've seen them fainting from hunger while installing golden fixtures. When I protested, he said I didn't understand business." The archaeological team made a startling discovery in 1994. A mass grave containing the remains of 17 individuals, all showing signs of severe malnutrition and untreated injuries. Forensic analysis suggested these were workers who had died during the harsh winter of 1909 to 1910. They had been buried without ceremony, without markers, without even the decency of coffins, just bodies wrapped in canvas and deposited in a hastily dug pit. This discovery prompted a broader investigation into Clark's labor practices across his empire. Researchers found similar patterns at his mines, his timber operations, and his smelters. The mansion wasn't an exception to Clark's business practices. It was their perfect crystallization. A monument built on the broken bodies of men whose names were deliberately erased from history. In 2001, the Montana legislature passed a resolution acknowledging the grave injustices committed during the Gilded Age, specifically mentioning the Clark Mansion. A memorial was erected at the site listing the names of all workers who could be identified, 273 names representing at least 1,000 whose identities were lost forever. The memorial's inscription reads, "They built a palace for one man's pride. Their labor remains though their voices were silenced." The most recent revelations came in 2019 when climate change researchers studying historical weather patterns discovered something extraordinary in the mansion's records. Clark had maintained obsessive meteorological data, but hidden within these logs were coded entries that appeared to be Morrison's secret documentation of abuses. Using statistical analysis software, researchers decoded entries that revealed systematic sexual assault of female servants, covered up through dismissals and payoffs, with at least 12 women affected between 1912 and 1925. Today, archaeologists continue to study the site using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques. Each scan reveals new anomalies, possible unmarked graves, forgotten foundations, underground spaces that don't appear on any blueprints. The mansion may be gone, but its secrets continue to surface like splinters working their way out of infected flesh, each revelation adding another layer to our understanding of the true cost of America's Gilded Age palaces. Chapter 9. The Mansion's Long Shadow. The Clark Mansion may have vanished from the Montana landscape in 1937, but its influence continues to ripple through the state's consciousness like a stone thrown into still water 8 decades ago. Its legacy lives not in stone and marble, but in legislation, literature, and the living memory of families whose ancestors built, maintained, and ultimately survived William Andrews Clark's monument to excess. In 2015, Maria Chen Sullivan stood before the Montana State Legislature holding a photograph of her great-great-grandfather, one of the Chinese woodcarvers who had spent 4 years creating the mansion's intricate details while living in underground dugouts. "This building," she said, gesturing to the Capitol built partly with Clark's money, "stands on the same foundation of exploitation. My family's story was erased from official histories, but we remember. We demand that Montana remembers, too." Her testimony was part of a successful campaign to include labor history in Montana's educational curriculum. Today, 8th graders studying Montana history learn not just about copper kings and their wealth, but about the workers who created it. The Clark Mansion has become a central case study, its story used to illustrate the human cost of industrialization and the dangers of unchecked capitalism. The mansion's ghost haunts Montana's preservation movement. When developers propose demolishing historic buildings, advocates invoke the Clark Mansion's destruction as a cautionary tale. "We lost one of America's great houses to greed and indifference," says Robert Hutchinson, president of the Montana Preservation Alliance. "Every time we fail to preserve our architectural heritage, we repeat the mistake that turned the Clark Mansion into wheat fields." Yet the preservation debate reveals deep contradictions. Should Montana have preserved a monument to exploitation? Dr. Sarah Rising Crow, a historian from the Crow Nation, argues that the mansion's destruction was itself a form of justice. Indigenous peoples watched our sacred sites destroyed to build Clark's empire. Why should we mourn the loss of his palace? Sometimes erasure is what monuments to oppression deserve. The mansion's influence extends into unexpected realms. Modern Montana labor law includes provisions directly traceable to abuses during the mansion's construction. The state's requirement that employers provide water and basic shelter for workers its prohibition on company store debt bondage, and its mandate for transparent wage calculations all emerged from investigations into Gilded Age labor practices, with the Clark Mansion serving as Exhibit A. In the art world, the dispersal of Clark's collection continues to generate controversy. In 2018, a Monet painting that once hung in the mansion's drawing room sold for $43 million at Christie's. The buyer was a Chinese technology billionaire who announced he was purchasing it in honor of the Chinese workers whose unpaid labor helped finance its original acquisition. He donated it to a museum in Beijing with a plaque describing its provenance through exploitation. The site itself has become a pilgrimage destination for an unlikely coalition: labor historians, ghost hunters, and descendants of the mansion's builders and servants. Every summer, the Mansion Memories Gathering brings together hundreds of people whose families were connected to the estate. They share photographs, documents, and oral histories, slowly reconstructing the human story that official records tried to erase. Tom Sullivan Kowalski, whose Irish great-grandfather was a footman and Polish great-grandmother was a housemaid who met at the mansion, organizes these gatherings. "Our families found love in that place of loneliness," he says. "We're living proof that beauty and meaning could grow even in the shadow of oppression. The mansion failed as Clark's monument to himself, but it succeeded in bringing together people who created their own legacies." The economic impact of the mansion's story continues today. Dark tourism, travel to sites associated with death and suffering, brings thousands of visitors annually to the empty field where the mansion stood. Local entrepreneurs sell Clark Mansion ghost tours, though there's nothing to see but wheat fields. The Yellowstone County Museum's most popular exhibit remains its collection of mansion artifacts, each piece accompanied by the story of the worker who created or maintained it. Hollywood has repeatedly attempted to tell the mansion's story, but each effort has collapsed under the weight of its contradictions. How do you create a protagonist from a cast of victims and villains? A 2019 Netflix series was canceled after descendants of Clark's servants protested that it romanticized their ancestors' suffering. A proposed film focusing on the workers' stories couldn't secure financing. Studios deemed it too depressing for audiences. Academic study of the mansion has produced profound insights into American mythology. Dr. Jennifer Hartley, whose discoveries revolutionized understanding of the mansion, writes, "The Clark Mansion represents the American dream's dark inversion, proof that unlimited success for one requires unlimited suffering for many. We tell ourselves that America is the land of opportunity, but the mansion reminds us it's also the land of exploitation. Both truths exist simultaneously." The mansion's destruction paradoxically ensured its immortality. Had it survived, it might have become just another historic house museum, its ugly truths sanitized for tourist consumption. Instead, its absence forces us to confront what it represented. The empty field where it stood has become what philosopher Dr. James Brightwater calls a monument to absence, more powerful than presence because it requires us to actively remember rather than passively observe. As Montana grapples with new inequalities, tech billionaires buying vast ranches, housing costs pricing out working families, the Clark Mansion serves as both warning and inspiration. Its story reminds us that excessive wealth concentration isn't natural or inevitable, but the result of specific choices that can be challenged, changed, and ultimately overcome. Chapter 10. The palace that never was stand in the wheat field today, where William Andrews Clark's mansion once rose, and you'll find nothing. Not a foundation stone, not a fragment of marble, not even a depression in the earth to mark where 56,000 square feet of ambition once stood. The wind moves through the grain in waves that locals say sound like whispering. though whether it's the voice of the mansion or its builders depends on who's listening. This is the most honest monument Clark could have asked for, an absence that speaks louder than presence ever could. The mansion failed at everything it attempted. It didn't secure Clark's social position, didn't create a family dynasty, didn't even succeed as architecture, being demolished before its 20th birthday. Yet, in its failure, it achieved an immortality Clark never imagined. It became a perfect symbol of the Gilded Age's gorgeous rot, a teaching tool more valuable than any palace. We've traced the story from Mary Keenan's first glimpse of those Italian gravel paths to Maria Chen Sullivan's testimony in the state legislature, from 400 men breaking frozen ground to build a dream to their descendants gathering in the same spot to reclaim their history. We've counted the costs: 31 dead workers, hundreds exploited, families destroyed, fortunes wasted. We've measured the excess: $3.2 million spent on emptiness, 44 servants maintaining vacant rooms, a swimming pool that hosted more leaves than swimmers. But what does this ghost palace tell us today, in our new Gilded Age of tech billionaires and wealth inequality that surpasses even Clark's era? It reminds us that monuments to ego are always built on others' backs, that every golden fixture has a shadow price paid in someone else's suffering, that the mansions we build, physical or metaphorical, to separate ourselves from humanity ultimately imprison us in solitude. The Clark Mansion asks us to look at our own palaces, the systems we maintain though they serve no purpose, the inequalities we polish like silver that will never hold food, the workers we render invisible while they maintain our comfort. It challenges us to see that every age thinks its excesses are justified, its exploitation necessary, its suffering invisible, until time strips away the guilt and reveals the bones beneath. This documentary ends where it began, in an empty field where a palace once stood. But you, watching this in your home built on indigenous land, wearing clothes sewn by invisible hands, surrounded by technology mined by children you'll never meet, you carry the mansion's questions with you. What palaces are we building today that tomorrow will see demolished? Whose stories are we erasing in our official histories? And when future generations stand in the ruins of our ambitions, what whispers will they hear in the wind?